Skeptics are fond of pointing to places in the Bible that contradict other places in the Bible. And while for the most part I'm okay with that, it's often done with a lack of finesse or even appreciation for why the contradictions exist in the first place. On the other side, inerrantists are adept at coming up with ways to reconcile contradictory accounts. Sometimes their attempts are plausible, sometimes they're bewildering. Like their skeptical counterparts, they tend to ignore the why of apparent contradictions in favor of forcing the Bible to present a narrative that simply isn't there. Inerrantists also have a habit of outright denying the existence of contradictions and will challenge skeptics to provide an example so that they can prove their creative know-how. So I want to do two things: accommodate the request for an example of a contradiction and offer some thoughts on why the contradiction exists at all. One of my favorite contradictions is one that is often overlooked by both skeptics and inerrantists, at least in my experience. It involves two texts from the canonical Gospels: Mark chapter 8, verses 11 through 13, and Matthew chapter 16, verses 1 through 4. Let's begin with Mark's account. Here's the story as it appears in the New Revised Standard Version. According to verse 11, the Pharisees come to Jesus with the intention of arguing with him, requesting a sign from heaven. As you can probably infer, the Pharisees aren't asking for divine skywriting. A sign from heaven is a roundabout way of saying verification from God. But verification of what? Bas van Eersel, in his commentary on Mark, writes that the Pharisees summon someone to furnish a sign from heaven as proof positive of the authenticity of his mission. But this is not an innocent request. At the end of verse 11, we read the participial peirasantes auton, rendered in the NRSV infinitively as to test him. Thus, there is an element of doubt that Jesus is truly an agent of God. Adela Yarbrough Collins writes in her commentary, "Their demand for a sign is thus analogous to the charge made by the scribes in chapter 3, verse 22, that Jesus casts out demons by the power of Beelzebul." Verse 12 brings us to Jesus' twofold response to their request. The first borderlines on the emotional. He sighed deeply in his spirit. These words render a participial form of anastenazo, a verb built on stenazo, which also refers to sighing or even groaning. Commentators have looked at Jesus' sighing here in a few different ways. Some, like Mary Ann Beavis, refer their readers to the entry for anastenazo in a Greek-English lexicon of the New Testament and other early Christian literature, BDAG for quick reference, wherein we read that the verb is used for distress in an apparently hopeless situation. Given Jesus' repeated confrontations with the Pharisees, seeing anastenazo in this way is not only plausible, but relatable. Others, like Eersel, connect Jesus' sighing to the prophetic character of his refusal to give the Pharisees a sign. Eersel writes that, by sighing deeply, Jesus tunes himself in to the wavelength of the Spirit, pneuma, before pronouncing the apodictic-sounding judgment. This, too, has a ring of truth to it, since, as Paula Fredrickson observes in her classic From Jesus to Christ, the followers of Jesus had by and large failed to grasp his meaning, embrace its message of suffering, and endure with constancy. They were a faithless generation, and to such a generation Jesus would grant no sign. Of interest is Ezekiel chapter 21, verses 11 through 12, as it appears in the Septuagint. There we read, "And you, Son of man, sigh at the destruction of your loins, and in pain you will sigh before their eyes. And it will be that if they say to you, 'For what reason are you sighing?' and you will say, because of the news that comes, and all hearts will be broken, and all hands will be weakened, and all flesh and every spirit will perish, and every thigh will be stained with urine. Behold, it comes, and will be, says the sovereign Lord. 3 times we read of the prophet sighing, using stenazo or a variation of it in this passage, and one cannot help but see some connection with our passage in Mark chapter 8. Yet another possibility is proffered by Joel Marcus in his commentary for the Yale Anchor Bible series. He begins by noting that stenazo is used by Mark in chapter 7, verse 34, and refers readers to his notes for that section. In analyzing Jesus' sigh there, Marcus surveys the ways previous scholars have handled it, noting its connection with ancient magical techniques. In one take, sighing is evidence of the magician's reliance on a source of power outside himself/herself. An interpretation, he thinks, garners support from the immediate Markan context, since Jesus' sighing directly follows his raising his eyes to heaven in an attitude of supplication to God. He then says, Jesus' sigh may also suggest a struggle with a demonic obstacle, noting that in certain pseudepigraphic texts, demons will sigh when wrestling with an exorcist, and if they can sigh during such a struggle, then it makes sense for an exorcist to sigh as he struggles with the demon. Returning to his notes on chapter 8, verse 12, Marcus suggests that the use of sighing probably has a similar satanic nuance. All 3 interpretations have their merits, but that is not important at the moment. Whatever is going on with Jesus' sighing, it isn't a good sign for the Pharisees. Pun intended. This becomes clear as we continue reading verse 12 and find Jesus' second response, a verbal one that is itself in 2 parts. The first is a rhetorical question. Why does this generation ask for a sign? Errant is particularly helpful here in understanding the import of the phrase, this generation. He writes, with only one occurrence in the Old Testament, namely Genesis chapter 7, verse 1, where it refers to the contemporaries of Noah, the term has such a strong connotation of incorrigible depravity that it is also dominant in places where that depravity is not expressed. The term denotes a kind of contempt, which also colors the end of the episode. While Errant is no doubt correct that the negative phrase, this generation, occurs but once in the entirety of the Old Testament, references to generation throughout the scriptures of Israel abound, and they are often imbued with negative overtones. For example, in Psalm 78, the psalmist says that he and his people will tell future generations of God's miraculous deeds, so that, per verse 8, they should not be like their ancestors, a stubborn and rebellious generation, a generation whose heart was not steadfast, whose spirit was not faithful to God. With this question, Jesus signals his frustration with the Pharisees particularly, but, as Paula Fredrickson suggests, also the general faithlessness he encounters nearly everywhere he goes, even among the 12. It leads to the second part of his verbal retort. Truly I tell you, no sign will be given to this generation. Let's table this for later. For now, it should be noted that coupled with verse 13, there is a sense of finality to Jesus' reply. He will not give in to the Pharisees' request. So, in Mark's account, the Pharisees come to Jesus to test him and ask for a sign from heaven, but Jesus doesn't take the bait, and he refuses to give them one. With that, let's now turn to Matthew's version. Here's the story, as it appears in the New Revised Standard Version. It begins similarly enough to the account in Mark chapter 8, except to the Pharisees the author has added the Sadducees. Their appearance together here in chapter 16 is not the first time they are paired. In chapter 3, verse 7, they make a visit to John the Baptist as he is immersing people in the Jordan River in the wilderness of Judea, likely to watch what was going on and not, as many English translations suggest, to be baptized. In the passage following, chapter 16, verses 1 through 4, Jesus warns the 12 of the yeast of the Pharisees and Sadducees, a euphemism for their teaching, per verse 12. Jesus' reply to their request is different than what we find in Mark's Gospel. There is no mention of a sigh, nor is there a rhetorical question. Instead, the Matthean Jesus' response appears in 4 parts. The first is the recitation of an aphorism that Jesus claims his opponents are acquainted with. You, too, are likely familiar with it. I learned it as a child with this rhyme. Red sky at night, sailors' delight. Red sky at morn, sailors be warned. This leads to the second part of Jesus' reply, a rebuke. He says to his opponents at the end of verse 3, "You know how to interpret the appearance of the sky, but you cannot interpret the signs of the times." Donald Hagner, in his commentary on Matthew, notes that the phrase signs of the times is a reference to the signs in the ministry of Jesus marking the dawn of the Messianic age. Thus, Jesus is rebuking the Pharisees and Sadducees for asking for divine verification of his ministry, despite having been given plenty already. They can read the sky above, but they've missed entirely all that Jesus has done publicly before their very eyes. At the beginning of verse 4 comes the third part of Jesus' response. What was implied by Mark's "this generation" is verbally incarnated by Matthew with the colorful, "an evil and adulterous generation asks for a sign." This combination of adjectives attached to the noun generation is found earlier in the Matthean Gospel where, in a story quite similar to the present one, the scribes and Pharisees come to Jesus and, per chapter 12, verse 38, say, "Teacher, we wish to see a sign from you." Jesus' response there is the same as it is here, leading us to the fourth part of Jesus' reply. An evil and adulterous generation asks for a sign, says Matthew's Jesus in verse 4, but no sign will be given to it except the sign of Jonah. What is this sign of Jonah? According to chapter 12, verse 40, it is a reference to Jesus' own death and resurrection. Time does not permit an examination of this sign of Jonah and its importance. It suffices for our purposes to note that Matthew's Jesus is unwilling to provide any sign to his opponents, save for one, his own death and resurrection. There are many ways in which the two accounts of Mark and Matthew differ. Mark has only the Pharisees. Matthew has both the Pharisees and the Sadducees. The response of Mark's Jesus is curt, with only a rhetorical question and a denial of their request. Matthew's Jesus is more verbose, employing an aphorism before declaring that the only sign that will be given to the evil and adulterous generation is the sign of Jonah. Arguably, the minute details rise to the level of contradictions. Now, clever apologists may try to brush them aside and say things like, Mark mentions the Pharisees, but he doesn't say it was only the Pharisees. Harmonization knows no bounds. But what about the refusal to give a sign? Mark's Jesus never offers the qualification of a sign from Jonah that Matthew's Jesus does. What do inerrantists do with that? Here's one example. In his New International Encyclopedia of Bible Difficulties, the late Gleason Archer argued that there is little difference between Mark's and Matthew's version. The sign of Jonah, he contends, was not something he granted to Jesus' opponents on that same occasion when they requested it, but it was long deferred until Easter, In effect, therefore, he refused to give them any sign at all, at least at the time of their request. A couple of paragraphs later, Archer concludes that the apparent discrepancy between Matthew and Mark is akin to two students taking notes during the same lecture. For some parts of the lecture, one student has more full and detailed notes than the other. This doesn't mean that the pair have contradictory notes on the lecture. The same principle applies here, Archer finishes. While Archer was correct that in Matthew, Jesus refused to give them a sign right then and there, this is not the same thing as refusing to give any sign at all. A sign deferred is still a sign. Moreover, Archer's comparison of Matthew and Mark with students taking notes in a lecture seems superficially plausible, but it's when you dig into these texts that you begin to see just how problematic as an explanation it is. Let me show you why. Here is the Greek text of Mark chapter 8, verse 12, as it appears in the 28th edition of the Nestle Aland Greek text, as well as the NRSV's rendition of it. You'll see in red the words rendered in the NRSV as, "No sign will be given to this generation." Now, here is the Greek text of Matthew chapter 16, verse 4 from NA 28, as well as the NRSV's translation of it. You'll see in red the words rendered in the NRSV as, "No sign will be given to it except the sign of Jonah." Let's zero in on Mark chapter 8, verse 12 first. Here is the relevant portion. The clause begins with the conditional particle, a. If you've taken at least one semester of Koine Greek, then hopefully you'll recognize this as one of many ways to say the word if. Typically, a is used in a protasis, or the if clause of a conditional sentence, and is ordinarily followed by an apodosis, or then clause. The next word in this clause is dothesetai. You may have had to take a second semester of Koine to recognize where this word comes from. It's a future passive indicative form of the verb didomi. In college, I hated me verbs almost as much as I hated participles. The verb didomi means to give, and here it is in the third person singular, so we could render it is given or it will be given. Next, we have te genea taute. All three of these words are feminine, and all three are in the dative case. First, we have te genea, literally, to the generation. This is a reference to he genea chote, this generation, from earlier in verse 12. Modifying te genea is the demonstrative pronoun taute, this. So, we have to this generation. Finally, at the end of verse 12, we have the subject of the clause, the nominative semeion, a sign. This is a reference to the semeion apa tu oranu, a sign from heaven, from verse 11. I know, thrilling stuff, but bear with me, it's about to get interesting. Now, let's read our translation. If it will be given to this generation a sign. Or, to fit normal English syntax, if a sign is given to this generation. Or, to better emphasize the tense of the verb dothesetai, if a sign will be given to this generation. Two things should immediately stand out to you. The first is that here in Mark chapter 8, verse 12, we have one half of a conditional sentence, a protasis or if clause, but no apodosis or then clause. The second is that a literal rendering of the Greek text looks nothing at all like what we find in most English translations, including the NRSV. So, what's going on? In their commentary on the Gospel of Mark, John Donahue and the late Daniel Harrington note that the truncated conditional sentence of verse 12 appears to be an elliptical form of a Hebrew oath formula. Oaths are familiar enough. For example, you might tell your teenager, "I swear that if you don't clean your room, then you will not be going out with your friends tonight." In this instance, the oath is a conditional sentence that has both a protasis and an apodosis. In Hebrew, conditional sentences are often begun with the particle im, if. For example, here is the Hebrew text of Judges chapter 4, verse 8. Note that after the formula introducing speech, colored in blue, that we have two conditional sentences, each beginning with im, colored in red. The apodices are marked either by the Hebrew conjunction vav, colored in green, or is implied by the use of the anticipated negative result, indicated by the particle lo, colored in green. Hebrew oaths follow two general patterns. The first are oaths wherein the one swearing is doing so in favor of performing some action. These are typically introduced with the construction im lo, if not. That is, if one doesn't perform an action, then some negative consequence will fall on them. Thus, im lo is used to express that someone will do something. The other type of oath is one in which the swearer is against performing some action. These are ordinarily introduced with the particle im. In these oaths, the swearer is saying that if some action is performed, then some negative consequence will fall on them. In these oaths, then, im is used to express that the swearer will never do something. Let's consider an example from the Psalms. Here is the Hebrew text of Psalm 95, verse 11, along with its English counterpart in the NRSV. I've placed in red the conditional sentence that is relevant to our discussion. Following the first part of the verse, we read, Im yavo'un el menuchati. Right away, we recognize the particle im, if. It's followed by the call imperfect, yavo'un, I will go, or I will enter. Next is the preposition, el, into. And finally, the direct object, menuchati, my resting place, or simply my rest. Here, the protasis ends, but note that there's no apodosis. As in Mark chapter 8, verse 12, we have an if clause, but no then clause. So, what is Yahweh, mediated by the psalmist, saying? Since, in the words of Christo Vandermeer, Jacobus Naudet, and Jan Kretz, an oath depends on the suppression of an imprecation upon a person, Yahweh is inviting a negative consequence to befall him should the stubborn Israelites of that generation enter his resting place. In other words, he is calling down a curse upon himself. The force of this is an outright denial of entrance into Yahweh's rest. How does the Septuagint, the Greek translation of the Hebrew Bible, handle this conditional sentence? Here is Psalm 94:11 in that translation. I've placed in red the relevant clause. Look familiar? Like Mark chapter 8 verse 12, the conditional clause begins with the particle a, which is then followed by the future indicative eis elusantai, they will enter, which is then followed by the prepositional phrase eis tein katapausen mu, into my rest. Missing here is the apodosis, the then clause. Like its Hebrew counterpart, the force of the apodosis-free conditional sentence is to categorically deny any chance that Yahweh will allow the rebellious generation into his rest. Returning to Mark chapter 8, we are now in a better position to understand what Jesus is doing. He's inviting an imprecation upon himself should a sign be given to this generation. Donahue and Harrington write of the elliptical form of a Hebrew oath formula that a modern formulation of the formula would be, I'll be damned if such and such happens. Jesus is forcefully and categorically denying that a sign from heaven, divine verification for his ministry, will be offered to this generation. Let's now turn to Matthew's version of the story. Here's the Greek text again. The clause begins with the coordinating conjunction kai, and, followed by the nominative semeion, sign. Then, Matthew employs the same verb used in Mark chapter 8, verse 12, and in the same form, a future passive indicative form of the verb didomi, will be given. However, Matthew does something to this verb that Mark does not. In front of it is a tiny two-letter particle, ou. For first semester Greek students, this little word is easy points on a translation quiz. It's a negating particle and turns will be given to will not be given. Following this is the dative feminine pronoun aute, to it, which must refer to the feminine genea ponera kai moikalis, a generation evil and adulterous, or an evil and adulterous generation. Then we have something that is definitely not in Mark's Gospel. Like Mark, Matthew uses the conditional a, but does so by coupling it with the negative particle may. Together, a may indicate an exception to the aforementioned denial given in the first part of the clause. So, what is the exception? It is ta semeion Jonah, the sign of Jonah. As noted earlier, this sign is Jesus' death and resurrection. So, in Mark's version of the scene, Jesus not only denies the Pharisees' request, he also states categorically, by means of an oath, that no sign at all would be given to this generation. No exceptions. But in Matthew's account, not only is the oath gone, but an exception has been made. The two accounts are clearly contradictory. For many skeptics, it would be enough to just stop there and leave it be, but it's far more interesting to ask why the contradictions exist. Why has Matthew changed Mark the way he has? What possible motivations would he have for doing so? Before we get to that, let me just briefly say that I'm working on the assumption of Markan priority, the idea that both the authors of Matthew and Luke had before them in composing their gospel, Mark's gospel. Now, I'm not going to defend that here, because it is the consensus view among New Testament scholars. Fate permitting, in the future I'll make a video detailing why I think Markan priority makes the best sense of the available evidence. So, what might have motivated Matthew to make the alterations to Mark's account? Let's begin with the removal of the Markan oath. Donahue and Harrington write that Mark's oath is in stark contrast to Jesus' attack on oaths in Matthew chapter 5, verses 33 through 37, which may explain Matthew's omission of this oath in chapter 16, verses 1 through 4. The passage to which Donahue and Harrington refer appears in the famous Sermon on the Mount, and is in a section wherein Jesus interprets Torah with the goal of keeping his followers far from violating it. In chapter 5, verses 33 through 37, he argues against swearing by anything: heaven, which is God's throne, earth, which is God's footstool, Jerusalem, which is God's city, and so on, but should instead, let your word be yes, yes, or no, no. The late R.T. France writes concerning verse 37 of this passage, Jesus' prohibition of swearing is based on the assumption that God requires truthfulness. A simple yes or no should be all that is needed. As soon as it is necessary to bolster it with an oath in order to persuade others to believe what is said, the idea of transparent truthfulness has been compromised. This point is made all the more emphatically by the final words of verse 37. Anything more than this comes from the evil one, or simply evil. It is easy to see why Matthew's Jesus would not invoke an imprecatory oath. In his tradition, swearing should be unnecessary, because one's character should be such that a yes or a no is sufficient without adding anything to bolster it. If a tradition prohibiting swearing perhaps motivated Matthew to make his change to Mark, what about the addition of an exception in the form of a sign of Jonah? If you read the Gospel of Mark, you'll notice something that is in some respects quite odd. Jesus' identity is known to precious few in the narrative. While he's declared to be God's Son at his baptism in Mark chapter 1 verses 10 through 11, the language suggests it was more of a vision in which God tells him that he is the beloved Son. Additionally, for much of the Gospel, the only ones who know Jesus' true identity are his supernatural opponents, the demons. Yet he repeatedly shuts them up whenever they try to out him. For example, in Jesus' first public miracle, recorded in chapter 1 verses 21 through 28, a demon refers to him as the Holy One of God. In the very next verse, verse 25, Jesus responds with rebuke. Be silent and come out of him. A few verses later, in verse 34, the narrator reports that Jesus performs multiple exorcisms, but would not permit the demons to speak, because they knew him. Even when Jesus does reveal who he is, it is typically done in private, and is followed by misunderstanding and bewilderment. For example, in chapter 6, verses 45 through 52, Jesus walks out on the waves to the disciples, striking terror in their hearts, as they cannot tell who it is until Jesus identifies himself. At the end of the story, having witnessed this impressive display of divine power, the narrator says, "And they were utterly astounded, for they did not understand about the loaves, but their hearts were hardened." And when Jesus thrice informs his disciples that he would suffer, die, and rise again, they thrice demonstrate how bullheaded they tend to be. For example, in chapter 9, verses 30 through 32, while on their way through Galilee, Jesus tells his disciples that he would be handed over to humans, killed, and be raised back to life. Verse 32 reads, "But they did not understand what he was saying, and were afraid to ask him." It is therefore with great irony that it isn't until after his death on the cross that Jesus' identity as God's Son is recognized, but not by a disciple, for they had all deserted him. Instead, it was a centurion, a member of the very force that killed him, who declares it. Now when the centurion, who stood facing him, saw that in this way he breathed his last, he said, "Truly this man was God's Son." These motifs of hiddenness and misunderstanding have long been noted by scholars. In fact, Jesus' reluctance to allow his messianic identity to become known publicly has a name: the Messianic Secret. Though emphasized in Mark's Gospel, these motifs do not carry quite the same prominence in the Gospel of Matthew. For example, while Mark lacks a birth narrative, Matthew has an impressive one, complete with a cosmic sign that a Jewish king has been born. And whereas Mark's Jesus experiences a personal revelation at his baptism, "You are my son, the beloved," Matthew's account is more public. "This is my son, the beloved." In Matthew chapter 8, verse 16, the parallel to Mark chapter 1, verse 34, Jesus is said to have performed exorcisms, but gone is the command for silence because they knew who he was. In the Matthean account of Jesus' jaunt on the waves, the scene doesn't end with the disciples unaware of what's going on, but rather, as it says in chapter 14, verse 33, with something far more impressive. "And those in the boat worshipped him, saying, 'Truly, you are the Son of God.'" And in the parallel to Mark chapter 9, verse 32, found in Matthew chapter 17, verse 23, the disciples aren't said to lack understanding. Instead, verse 23 ends with the words, "And they were greatly distressed." This downplaying, though not complete removal, of the hiddenness and secrecy motifs that Matthew found in Mark may be why his Jesus has no difficulty offering as the only sign he is willing to give his opponents, that of his own death and resurrection. The question is, will they heed its meaning? Will they understand that his resurrection entails that the end of the age is upon them? Will they be motivated, like the Ninevites in the story of Jonah, to repent? While the two accounts of Mark chapter 8 and Matthew chapter 16 clearly contradict one another, it is the reasons why they do so that is far more interesting. And in my opinion, skeptics who want to point out contradictions should do so with an eye for understanding the reasons underlying those discrepancies. That is a far more enlightening path.